My name is Kaswan Hassan. I'm a research scholar and teach at the University of Houston Law Center. And on behalf of the Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Center, or INA Center, here at the University of Houston Law Center, we are delighted to welcome you today to webinar in our environmental law and policy. And we are especially honored to host Professor Alice Kaswan, a professor of law and also a Dean's Circle Scholar at the University of San Francisco School of Law. So for today's webinar, I will moderate the webinar with my colleague and our faculty at the University of Houston Law Center and INA Center, Professor Chinonso Anozi. So as you know, Professor Kaswan is one of the nation's leading scholars on environmental justice, environmental law, climate change law. Her work explores intersection of climate policy, administrative law, equity, and asking how legal system can promote both sustainability at the same time fairness and justice. She has published extensively in a top law review and also environmental law journals, including Harvard Environmental Law Review, Ecology Law Quarterly, and Environmental Law Reporters. At the USF School of Law, Professor Kaswan teaches and writes on environmental law, administrative law, and climate change law, and has served in a leadership roles with the American Bar Association's section on environment, energy, and natural resources. Her scholarship has been instrumental in shaping nations' conversations about equitable decarbonization and the role of governments in clean energy transition. So in today's webinar, which is titled Government Funding and Climate Governance, Rethinking the Role of Grantors in Clean Energy Transition, she examines one of the most important and yet understudied tools of climate action, which is public funding. So as you know that climate impacts intensify, and our major legislation that passed in several years ago, including Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act, directs billions of dollars toward clean energy and sustainability. Today, Professor Kaswan invites us to think deeply about how these funds and governance, who control and how agencies spend these funds, who set the goals, and who do we ensure that the climate investment reach the communities and sectors that need them most. So it's incredibly timely, thought-provoking topic, and we are truly honored to welcome you, Professor Kaswan, for today's webinar. So if you have any question, please type your question, write your question in a Q&A box, and we have 20 minutes at the end of the talk, and I will share the CLE credit immediately after the talk. So please join us in welcoming Professor Kaswan for this important topic.
Well, I'm honored myself to be joining you for this time together, and certainly appreciate all of us thinking about how do we do climate governance in these challenging times. All right, so moving right along, when we think about environmental law, we've got a number of buckets to focus on. Many of us have historically focused on regulation and how it operates and controls polluters, or on litigation, other ways to control polluters. But a very important dimension to a clean energy transition is not only how we regulate or control, but also how we invest to support a new model for energy and environment. All right, so we're going to be thinking about transitioning to a clean energy future through lots of modalities at multiple scales in multiple sectors, our utilities, our transmission, our industry, our agriculture, but also about households and transportation and many day-to-day activities. So as was suggested, we have lots of questions about how we should do these investment. Who's going to control the decisions? What mechanisms work best where? Who participates and who benefits? Now, we're in challenging times, and this may seem like a hard time given all of the federal cutbacks, all the federal clawbacks of the money that has been allocated so far. But I'll just note that we still have the states. We trundle along with important authority and potential within the states. And also, I think we have a bit of an interval to consider how we might improve this funding governance when the next opportunities arise. And I have to keep the hope up that we will have more opportunities in the future. So before we go any farther, I want to just note that I'm going to be talking primarily about climate justice dimension of a clean energy transition. There are lots of investments, again, that need to be made, but I'll be focusing on these. So with that in mind, here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk a little about why justice matters as we think about where investments can and should go, why we should take equitable or equity into account. I'm going to give us just a bird's eye view of some of the mechanisms so we're a little more grounded in what we're really talking about when we think about funding. Just a little bit on the state of play. I could talk a long time about that, but a little bit to ground us in where we are in terms of funding, especially at the federal level. And then I will review a number of challenges that I think the lack of planning, lack of cross-sector collaboration, opportunities for meaningful participation, and persistent issues around access. And then I hope to close with a few recommendations to chart at least some ideas for a path forward. All right, so starting with why justice should matter, we've got lots of dimensions to justice when we talk about justice. So one is distributional justice. And from this perspective, we can think about wealth disparities. The line on the top in blue there is about the level of wealth for white households. This is going up just to 2004, but it shows that the level of wealth households wealth. And then when we look at the red and the orange lines, we're looking at Black and Latino. To look at slightly more recent data in 2022, the median wealth for white families was 285,000, and the median wealth for Black families was less than 45,000. So less than 20% of the white median income. And this has implications for who is going to be able to make this transition. So who has expensive old air conditioning that they might not even be able to afford to run versus who can afford solar on their house with a heat pump, right? That allows them to be able to cool their homes with electricity they're generating at home, who can make those investments. And we also have concerns that those who are unable to transition to clean electricity are going to bear a lot of the costs of electricity rates rise, and they don't have mechanisms for insulating themselves from those increasing rates by more energy efficiency or even that household solar and the like. So that's distributional justice. Who's going to have access to the ability to make the investments at the household or community level to make a clean transition? And I think there are also corrective justice implications. I don't know how many of those attending are from Houston, but I have a map of Houston and the history of redlining in Houston, which was about access to basically to mortgages, which meant access to the ability to buy a home for the most part. So this injustice we just saw in existing wealth disparities is significantly attributable to this history of redlining. And redlining was not just about, where people could live, right? But it was about access to pathways to wealth. Really, homeownership has been a critical mechanism for wealth accumulation in this country. Not the only, but a critical mechanism. And so there are lots of ways in which our history of discrimination in the country has led to these pervasive disparities in wealth. And so that means we may think about this entitlement to some degree of resources as not only a matter of improving distributional justice, but also a consequence of corrective justice. And for those who are looking for more reasons, I think we have a more utilitarian, cross-cutting justification, which is that we, to deal with the climate crisis, are going to need to bring our emissions down. We're going to need to decarbonize. And we're not going to be able to decarbonize, to eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels, unless everyone transitions. And people who don't have their own resources to do so aren't going to be able to decarbonize unless we provide some kind of funding, whether it's through public funding, philanthropic, or otherwise. We're not going to get to zero or close to zero unless we provide funding for the low-income households and communities that can't do it themselves. All right, so if we're thinking about climate justice, as I mentioned earlier, what kinds of investments are we thinking about? What is it that we need if we want to deal with a transition at this scale? So as I suggested earlier, we're looking at decarbonizing households and businesses. That means eliminating gas, right? Heating, cooking, hot water, and electrifying those sources, likely with these heat pumps, right, that can both heat and cool. Also means investments in energy efficiency to reduce our demand for electricity. Still a lot that can be done in that area. One possibility, it's not essential, but one possibility is to have decentralized electricity through both household and community solar and storage, right? You need to generally combine both. And then in the transportation sector, again, we often think about the cars, right, and electric cars, but we also want to be thinking about our investments in clean, safe, and affordable public transit. Also need to think about land use, right? So how do we have denser communities so that people don't have to make or commute as long a distance? And also to make transit more effective, because it's very hard to do public transit if you've got a very widely dispersed population. It's much more effective if they're more concentrated. And then let's not forget about walking and biking. I see a lot of investments in cities now in improving biking as an alternative to motorized transit. Okay, so that's the kinds of things. Now let's look at what the mechanisms often are, again, just to ground us before we turn to the challenges and get a sense of these funding mechanisms so we can see what kinds of decisions are at stake. So we have a lot of choices about how we're going to fund a clean energy transition. Some programs are focused on individual households or businesses, while others are more on the community scale. So looking first at the individual level, we've got things like tax credits. The Inflation Reduction Act had these for cars and solar and decarbonization efforts. Rebates also in the Inflation Reduction Act. These go a little faster because you don't have to wait until tax time to get the money. Vouchers, where you can actually apply and get the money up front. So you don't have to pay yourself, but you can just turn in the voucher and get your and lower the cost of whatever it is you want. And then there are grants. So if you're talking about grants for individuals, most of them are first come, first serve, right? Apply for this grant for you to install the solar, or for your business, or the truck for your new fleet. Many are first come, first serve, but some are competitive. In California, at least, some of the truck programs for clean trucks are competitive applications for people who are trying to decarbonize their individual or fleets of trucks. And in California, we also have a kind of a shift going on to need-based provision, which involves a sort of competition, right? Who's going to show the biggest need? So they'll be evaluating the applications. And then there are direct services. So another mode which says that if you apply, you will get the direct service. So people will come and provide the service. You don't arrange for it yourself. They provide the contractor who does the work. So weatherization programs often work this way, like the Weatherization Assistance Program, a federal program administered by the states. We see this in some solar programs. California's got a new one for decarbonization. That'll be what they call the direct install program. So direct service is part of another mechanism for providing services. And then we have financing. Sometimes it's not about providing money or a service, but just making it easier to borrow by providing loan guarantees or helping lenders know how to do this. There are lots of programs now that are doing this at both the state and the federal level. That recent and now frozen greenhouse gas reduction fund at the federal level was had a lot of focus on financing, not just direct resource provision or money provision. At the community level, we are looking at, trying to get my PowerPoint to move, there we go, different ways of handing out money. Sometimes it's formula funding. So, for example, in California, there's a low carbon transit operation. So looking at how to do low carbon transit. And that is at least partly allocated based on formula. And all the recipients are required to devote 50% to benefit what we call here in California priority populations. That's looking at both low income and other kinds of disadvantage. But many of the community-based grants are competitive, so that the folks who are looking for a community-based grant do have to apply. Sometimes it's for a discrete benefit or benefits. It might be for something like community solar. And sometimes, and quite interestingly, some of these have been more flexible, enabling communities to apply to obtain a range of benefits and engage in community-based planning. This might be plans to combine housing and transit. California's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant Program involves this kind of combined and flexible goals. Or a range of transportation options as a community determines within that, a lot of modalities being possible, or even broader and more flexible grants like the federal community change grants, which allowed communities to engage in planning to determine what kinds of clean energy investments they wanted to make. And then lastly, at the community level, we have in some states grants that are devoted to community capacity building and community planning. So that sort of gives you a sense of the kinds of mechanisms. Where are we in all this? What's our state of play? And I have to say a little bit, I'm going to describe the state of play before the current administration. So looking at Biden administration and prior to that time. With Biden, we did have a major focus on how funding is allocated. And one of the interesting programs here was the Justice 40 initiative, which was enacted through executive order and required 40% of agencies' discretionary funding to benefit historically marginalized communities. And 19 agencies had identified 518 programs to which this would apply. We have also, as I've referred to already, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm assuming you all know about. And of the $369 billion in climate and energy funding, many programs directly or indirectly served environmental justice. Estimates range from 40 to 60 billion for that. The largest chunk of that was for this greenhouse gas reduction fund, which had $7 billion for the Solar for All program, which was looking at handing out grants to about 60 recipients for residential and community solar. And then 20 billion was for sort of public-private partnerships. 14 billion was essentially a green bank allocation, and about 50 to 75% of that was supposed to benefit disadvantaged communities. And then 6 billion to support community lending. All of that meant to target communities that are often lacking in resources. Many of that, again, hoping to lend. Now, in addition to that, we had the community change grants I mentioned a moment ago. That was about $3 billion. And this was to implement really community generated and community benefiting plans. So as you know, the administration and Congress really have worked together at this point to freeze and claw back many of these funds. Much of it had already been allocated, but much of it is now frozen, and they're actually going farther than was initially anticipated and trying to take back funds that had already gone to the grantees. There's lots of litigation around this. It's going in various directions. It's not going very well, I would say, at this point, in terms of not actual losses, but earlier efforts to unfreeze funds have now failed at the appellate level. So really some significant impacts here. Nonetheless, as I said, we can't give up on climate policy. I think we have an interlude at this point then to think about where to go next time. Again, we can hope that these programs do get revived, but we're not going to be done once and if they're revived. And we want to be thinking about next time. And obviously, again, the states still have the power to continue to act in this front. In the states, New York has legislation that was modeled after Justice 40, which of course is gone. It was on an executive order. So, but they have requirements that a certain percentage of the discretionary funding go to support disadvantaged communities in the environment space. And quite a number of states have cap and invest programs, sort of cap and trade, but revenue that comes out of those programs. And many of those have allocated money for disadvantaged communities and low-income communities, at least according to the entity that supervises California's longstanding cap and trade program. It's been in operation for 10 years now. Cumulatively, by their account, about 75% of the funds have gone to low-income and disadvantaged communities, and that's about $9 billion at that point. So some serious money at play in the states. And then many states have, of course, other investments that they make. It's not only from these cap and trade programs. So the path so far has been impressive. So again, it's great that we've seen major efforts at funding, and it's all well and good, I think, to say let's provide funding, but we do have some critical questions about how we invest. Who's planning, coordinating, setting at the program level the parameters with what input? How integrated and fragmented are these programs across agencies, and how do we know that the benefits are really going where they're intended or most needed? So I'm going to start to work through some of the challenges I think we have seen with the kinds of programs that have been out there to date, both at the federal and state level. One is about planning, having a vision and a plan. So from the agency perspective, we've got programs kind of all over the map, right? So if we're looking at energy efficiency, and I'll talk about this example many times today, but we've got Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency. They're channeling money sometimes through the states, and then the states and utilities have many of their own programs. So we've got kind of a piecemeal approach at the agency level with different agencies doing similar but different things. And then we have piecemeal uptake by recipients. So for example, if we're thinking about a transition to clean cars, well, we're relying on individual households to take advantage of what's in the marketplace. So not that we're going to force people, right, in this context, but still, it is all dependent on what recipients choose to do. And when it comes to things like resilience, let's take an adaptation example. We're relying on individual communities to apply, right? We're not planning where and how we need to have adaptation measures be taken and putting the money there necessarily. We're relying on a community to say, well, we need the money and we're going to apply for it. And again, that can be problematic, right? It's a marketplace and we let people act, but there are some concerns. One is the resources might not go where they are needed most, right? The community that's most in need of resilience funding. There's also some worry that one type of program might undermine another, right? So if we end up putting in some agencies a lot of effort into electric vehicles, right, without worrying about where they're going to go and what's going on, that could undermine other types of transportation planning that we're trying to do, right? If we're identifying certain areas as ideal for public transit and putting investments into public transit and walking and biking, how do efforts to support individual purchases intersect, right, with what might be more comprehensive and appropriate transportation planning in an area? And then, as I'll talk about more later, we have a lot of inefficiencies from fragmentation and duplication. All right, so those are kind of a lead in on this. I don't want to say that there's no planning, right? It does occur, of course. The legislature does some planning in deciding parameters, right? We want this money to go to these kinds of communities. So there's certainly some parameters that are going to give at least a general sense of what money can and can't be used for, that reflects some degree of priority setting, for example. And then to some degree, agencies do some planning about how they're going to spend their money, especially where they have discretion from the legislature. So in California, again, for example, some of their funds, not all, but some of their funds, they have some discretion over for transportation, clean transportation investments. And they go through a very substantial planning process. California Energy Commission also, again, much of their funding is dictated by legislation, but where there's a chunk that they have some discretion over, they go through a planning process on that. So there is some that's happening. On the other hand, we really don't have any kind of systematic and overarching assessments of what's needed on the ground and how existing programs are serving those needs, or what future funding priorities should be, looking across the clean energy transition landscape, not just within an agency's individual domains. And we don't really have any overarching deliberation about the best agencies and modalities to meet priority needs. Again, the legislature does dictate a lot of this, but they're not doing this kind of planning. And they're not asking agencies to do this kind of planning to either inform them or inform themselves. All right, so that's the planning challenge. And then let's look at holistic solutions and cross-sector collaborations to achieve them. Jim Rossi and Jody Friedman, who may be known to many of you, have stated that interagency coordination is one of the central challenges of modern governance. And that's true for a lot of government functions, including funding programs. Fundamentally, agencies are organized by sector, by expertise. They hire, people who are experts in transportation or in air pollution or in energy. And it's not conducive to cross-sector action to have agencies that are essentially siloed by expertise. This creates a couple of different kinds of problems. One of them is fragmentation. So let's consider managing the transportation and land use sector, right? So the Environmental Protection Agency has jurisdiction over pollution from vehicles, and the Department of Transportation, as well as the states, control roadways and transit systems, and local governments control land use. But all of these areas pollute, vehicles, roadways, transit, land use, they're all important to thinking about how we're going to manage our emissions from transportation, which are our biggest source of climate emissions. Or we can think about energy efficiency, or perhaps even distributed solar and storage. Local housing authorities control building conditions, but utilities or state energy offices, and to some degree also now the federal government, influence energy efficiency measures. But in many cases, you can't do energy efficiency, or you can't install solar, for example, if you don't have adequate housing conditions. This has been an obstacle in many instances to being able to do weatherization and the like because the housing, especially in low-income areas, is in poor condition, and you can't, and I'll use this example again, you can't install the double pane window if the window frames are rotted. So this kind of fragmentation among agencies can create problems. A different kind of issue is duplication. And here I'm thinking about incentives for energy efficiency. They can come, as I've suggested, through utilities, through state energy offices, through state housing offices, under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, through federal tax credits, and some other programs. And here I just included a snippet. Can you all read? No, I know you can't read that. A snippet from the 2022 ACEEE website inventory trying to list energy efficiency programs. The snippet doesn't cover them all, right? It just covers some of the programs. So you get a sense of the amount of duplication we have on opportunities for funding and other resources for energy efficiency. So, as I've already suggested, there's some real challenges that arise from this fragmentation and duplication. You can't coordinate related services, right? Again, the rotten window frames are going to keep you from installing energy efficient windows, or the bad roof is going to keep you from putting on the solar. And the duplication, right? Often people manage that duplication by doing what in this world is called stacking incentives, right? You get this tax credit and this grant and this voucher, right? And you put them together to be able to afford something. But often the parameters of these programs don't line up. They have different timelines, different application windows, different uh, uh, qualification requirements. And it makes it very difficult for consumers to be able to manage them, especially those who have the least time and the least resources and expertise. And that confusion and complexity of having these multiple programs can impede their participation, as we'll continue to know. The other thing is just thinking about the communities and the households we're trying to serve. They don't really experience life in the silos that characterize our administrative agencies, right? They're thinking about all the things they need, and the agencies just don't operate that way. So if we want to think about, communities or in households hoping for something that's more holistic, this is just not going to line up at all with their thinking about how they're hoping to have problems solved. That may be, again, more than what we can expect out of government, but it's just a misfit that we see between the way the agencies operate and the way that and what communities are hoping for. So we have some consequences, again, just to be clear, the consequences I was just looking at are consequences for effectiveness, but we also have some consequences for program efficiency. Agencies have got to conduct outreach for the same types of programs for the same types of recipients. So when we have all of those different, just going to make sure everybody's muted. So when we have all of those kinds of agencies at all different levels, all trying to conduct outreach to households for the same kinds of programs, that's not very efficient, right? Because they're all having to expend resources on that. Or even if they're doing different things, but they're all focused on the same consumer, right? One's trying to do water efficiency, one's trying to do energy efficiency, one's talking about distributed solar or storage. They're all reaching out to the same consumers, they're all having to process them separately. It's not that efficient here for our agencies. And then, as I suggested, the consumers are trying to, for them, thinking about it, and from an efficiency standpoint, they got to spend a lot of time with often multiple applications for a single type of improvement, right? They want energy efficiency, they want to stack incentives, but they've got to apply for a bunch of different programs or set of improvements. Again, that might impede their even applying, which is an effectiveness issue, but it's also just an efficiency concern for how we manage our programs, thinking about their time as well as the agency's time. And then a theme we often have in evaluating government programs is accountability, where we have a lot of programs and jurisdictions in the mix, all trying to do, say, energy efficiency, right? And we're trying to address their strengths and weaknesses. It can be hard to know what results are attributable to what, right? Because there's so many people and players in the mix. And there's also some risk, I think, of free riding, right? If one agency knows that there are a lot of other agencies that are doing the same kinds of things, they may put a little less muscle into the project than they would if they knew that a lot of folks were just depending on them. Now, I've talked a lot about the concerns that arise from fragmentation and duplication, but in thinking about the theory around governance here, I want to at least acknowledge that when we're thinking about the ideal framework, there are some benefits of maintaining distinct authority. So it's not all about complete consolidation. There are some values we get from having a diversity of approaches, right? The value of experimentation, and seeing how different approaches work gives us kind of a laboratory of invention that can have some benefits. Also, agencies may focus on different aspects of a technology. They may have different perspectives. So, for example, housing and urban development might be thinking about energy efficiency to enhance comfort and health in people's homes. And our energy department may be focusing a lot on climate and reducing emissions, but we might not want to consolidate everything into one agency that might only be bringing its own perspective and not other perspectives. So there's at least some value in making sure that we don't lose the perspective that different agencies bring to their programs. Um, Duplication also avoids the all-in-one basket, all eggs in one basket risk. So what if only one agency has the authority to do something and they drop the ball or the egg, to be a little messier in my analogies, right? So there's a risk, right? So again, we want to think about that in trying to imagine that the ideal part approach. And then if what we're talking about is not consolidation, but instead more coordination, right? Because it's not the only answer to these issues isn't creating just one agency. It might be coordinating agencies' provision. But if a lot of agencies are trying to coordinate and check with one another and otherwise, again, a lot depends on how they do it, but it is possible that we could end up with some delays. And so we do want to think about how our governance strategies for, working around cross-sector challenges address not only sort of the ideal system, but also one that's going to be able to get the job done in a timely way. All right. Now, again, I don't want to imply that this challenge is one that is all bad and no good. There are some good examples of coordination. We've seen a fair amount of coordination in terms of certain agency functions. And one area where that's happened a lot is in data about populations. I have a map here from California's environmental screening tool, which collects data about environmental circumstances and economic circumstances in census tracts across California. And that's something that all agencies can use. So they've created a centralized database that many agencies can then use. There is, hidden away in some archive, a federal one as well that was taken down unfortunately, by the current administration. But this gives you a sense of what they might look like. There also is some degree, and again, not a lot, but some degree of coordination and consolidation in outreach and technical assistance. I think one of the really powerful aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act was something called the Federal Thriving Communities effort, which created these technical assistance centers across the country that were designed to help communities and individuals have better information on and technical assistance for applying for this wealth of new federal programs that emerged under the Inflation Reduction Act. So that was an effort to, again, combine outreach and technical assistance efforts. And we also have, in some cases, some joint planning, right? So in California, the Energy Commission and the utility regulators have done some joint planning. We've seen some joint planning to some degree even in the housing and transportation context, although effectiveness has been limited on that. All right, so that's looking at functional integration to some degree around, agency functions. Substantively, right, really looking at their ability to do things across jurisdictional boundaries. Information sharing happens quite a bit, right? We'll let you know what we're doing, so at least you can have some knowledge about that and plan yourselves accordingly. I think the best example I have of this is from California, where we have a agency called the Strategic Growth Council, whose mission is to coordinate and work collaboratively, and it includes many heads of numerous agencies within California government. And then it also implements several cross-agency programs. So those programs are able to offer to the recipients essentially authorities that come under a lot of other different agencies. So they can do things that cover transportation and housing and energy, all under the umbrella of the Strategic Growth Council. So that's been, I think, is a very promising example of how to create an agency that actually has cross-jurisdictional authorities, often in coordination with the central agencies, but it gives a mechanism for that substantive authority. All right, I'll turn now to, time is passing. All right, ultimately agencies are silent. We are also looking at some real challenges in participation, both strategic planning and at a community scale. Sometimes if you have no planning, then you have no participation opportunities. So the less we plan, the less you can participate, and many environmental justice communities are eager to participate. And then where you do have program activities, development activities, like coming up with application parameters, the fact that we have so much fragmentation and duplication makes it really hard for advocates to participate because there's too much for them to have to follow and do. So we've got a lot of issues there. Access. Especially challenging to reach out to historically marginalized groups. We have a very complex political history that means people are marginalized due to a lack of resources, remote locations, mistrust of government historically, fear of deportation, and that requires often extra efforts to do outreach, often with the help of community-based organizations. There are also a lot of challenges to applying and to implementing grants that make people less willing to even apply. Complex processes, multiple programs, as I've said, with different requirements and deadlines. The large-scale grants require extensive data, information, and planning. And then to implement, you often need administrative resources. So many communities with very few resources and individuals may not apply in the first place because of this. Competitive pressures are also creating some real challenges. There are many more applications than available grants, so lots of folks are not getting money even if they are deserving. And many, again, are not applying because they don't think they're really going to be able to compete with the communities that have more resources. And also, why bother, right? If it's so uncertain that you'll even get the grant and you have so little resources to begin with, it may not seem like the wisest place to put your money. Agencies, again, are making efforts. These barriers are well known. Agencies are making efforts to address the challenges. But many of them are just not ultimately going to be enough to solve the problem. So what are we going to do? We need to have, again, more planning at multiple jurisdictional levels. We can talk about what that would look like later. Another recommendation that I have doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a start, is to actually have an agency that's devoted to providing funding services that would shift responsibility from the consumers to an agency that would go farther than some of the efforts that we've had so far to create a one-stop shop and make sure that they would be able to give consumers all they need. So they would be consolidating information from multiple different agencies operating at multiple jurisdictional levels, and go farther than just consolidating information, actually consolidate application processes and provide information and extensive technical assistance. And this would address both access barriers and reduce some of the drawbacks we see from fragmentation and duplication. Also, to improve interagency dynamics and enable cross-sector investments. Again, this is going to be very context specific, but maybe we need more agencies like the Strategic Growth Council that have cross-cutting authority, or allow even a single agency to make a cross-sector investment, right? Let the Energy Efficiency Agency also provide money for housing repairs, or consider, to some degree at least, consolidating duplicated programs. And lastly, I think we need to think about providing direct resources for the communities most in need, to flip the model and bring resources directly there and not require applications. So initially identify communities with the greatest need. For household related investments, they'd be automatically eligible. They would not need to apply. And for community level investments, we'd facilitate planning and access to sources and develop community appropriate implementation strategies, which might involve the agency actually taking on the implementation if the community doesn't have the resources. Again, funding, I think, is critical to our clean energy transition, especially for those who don't have their own resources. It's not enough to just allocate the money. It's imperative to think about how we govern our grants and tax credits and the like, and how we achieve both efficient and equitable mechanisms that are going to be effective in meeting our highest priorities. So with that, I will say thank you and leave just a few minutes, I hope, for some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kaswan, for that really insightful, carefully curated scholarship, sort of dissecting all the governance issues that we have and we see in funding clean energy programs in the United States. So we have a couple of questions here in the chat, and I will encourage others to also send in their questions if they have any, but I will start with the first one. It says, how should grant programs be designed? For example, via statutory mandates, appropriation language, grant terms, or agency rulemaking to embed accountability, flexibility, and equity. And I think there's another one, maybe I should read out the question and then we can take that all at the same time. And the second one says, how should courts balance congressional intent, executive discretion, and the interest of grantees?
Well, I'm not going to take those both at the same time. I'm going to make you repeat the second one. So I'll just take the first one first.
That's fine.
So the understory to what I'm saying is how much the legislature matters, right? So I've been talking a lot about agencies, but really, the legislatures agencies are creatures of their legislatures, and they determine, how much discretion the agencies have, how much they are defining the parameters. So I would argue that the legislatures need to be thinking about agency design. So I've talked about what I think agencies need, but I think it's legislatures that are ultimately going to have to give them the authority to do what I'm suggesting. So for planning, for example, I think we're going to really need the legislature to authorize an agency or more agencies to do the kind of planning I'm suggesting and provide some funding for it. I don't think agencies have the funding or the will to do that on their own, for example. In terms of really the actual design of programs, it has to be a mix of legislative parameters. I think setting priorities around equity and the like are important to come from the legislature to, address the risk of agency capture. So we've got to have that. But at the same time, I think there are also, you want some on the ground, specifics that have to be set by individual agencies in their own rulemaking processes. Often these are not rules; these are actually, the policy guidance or the manual for application. Right? Those are where key decisions often get made. Turning to your second question, could you repeat that? Because that's about the courts. I think that's a very different
Sure.
focus.
Gladly. It says, how should courts balance congressional intent, executive discretion, and the interest of grantees?
Well, ultimately courts are responsible for interpreting the statute and the regulations, and a lot is going to depend on the statute and the regulations. I'm a big believer when it comes to administrative law in really focusing in on purpose of the legislation. So if you have legislation that was designed to serve those most in need, then you want to evaluate whether the regulations, for example, are in fact designed to do that. So I'm a big believer in purpose and intent-driven analysis rather than sometimes hair-splitting plain language. But beyond that, I think that's how I'd answer that question.
Okay, folks, I think I have one more question, but folks, before we go, remember to grab the course number and also the CLE. For that, if you don't see it, please email my colleague, Karaman Hassan. He's going to send it across to you. So I want to also ask, this is coming from me as the moderator now.
Excellent, good, thank you.
Ask a question. I mean, when I read the paper, which was very good and beautifully written, straight to the point. When I read the paper, one of the things I get is that this raises this idea of funding clean energy, raises fundamental issues of energy justice, environmental justice. And I think about climate change as something that requires, as a phenomenon that requires holistic approach. So I'm thinking about in the current situation where we are right now, how can we be able to, how do you envision some of these governance issues around funding clean energy to happen comprehensively across the United States, considering some of the pushback against environmental justice or energy justice and all that? I mean, should we just leave it to the states and just have these pockets of funding within the United States? Is there any tools that are available within the federal structure to sort of continue to implement clean energy programs all over the United States?
Well, it's tricky, right? We're there. I mean, I think, the justice part is harder to maintain on a federal level because we have a federal government at every level that has so much antipathy toward these programs. My understanding is not every aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act has been gutted, that some of the money going to states for some rebates for energy efficiency and decarbonization actually wasn't gutted yet, maybe I should put. So not all of it is gone and some of it could still be useful. Sometimes we still have, but I think, we're relying really at the federal level on there continuing to be a market for clean energy generally. But again, that's not necessarily going to be for everybody. I think, we could talk about, this is more about politics really at this moment. Like, I don't know that I have a mechanism, right, that we can operate on the federal level, but I think we could talk about affordability. I think the efforts to crush wind and solar at the federal level are going to hurt consumers. And I think those are broadly applicable issues. in terms of pushback on issues of justice, if again, you have to still have that belief that we need to address climate change, and I think that's fairly widespread. If people are not compelled by the pure justice argument in the way about distributional and corrective justice that we like to talk about, then I think you can also talk about that utilitarian argument, which is, again, provided you believe decarbonization is necessary, which again is not a given at the federal level, it's not going to happen unless you provide support for those with the least resources. So, but again, that does require the preliminary belief in the need to decarbonize, and lacking that, we are stuck at the federal level. So I don't mean to be so pessimistic, but I think we have to just continue to talk about the value of renewable energy at a minimum for increasing energy supplies, which I think many are recognizing is necessary, and keeping energy affordable, which is deemed a cross-cutting issue and not just a justice issue. So that's our language, I think.
Yeah. So going away from that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things you identified, which is this cross-sector collaboration as one of the challenges. And when I read that, one of the things that came to my mind was we had all this monies sort of like indicated in the infrastructure bill, the BIP, and all of that, and most of them were not even deployed. So I'm wondering, is there an issue of just government inefficiency there as well, or is just a lack of this cross-sector collaboration? And if there is an issue of government inefficiency, maybe the cross-sector collaboration needs to also address the general inefficiency that we see in government. I don't know if you've thought about that, or you have any thoughts on how we could also address this sort of inefficiency that follow this lack of deployment of the available funds and the appropriated bills already. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's hard to know what's inefficiency. And, I think they're slightly different problems. So I think slowness is partly a function of, we're spending taxpayer money. And so you want to have rules and parameters around how that happens, and that takes time to develop. And so you had these huge amounts of money suddenly available, but you can't just hand it out, right? You've got to have the ability to structure it. A fair amount was given out, but a lot was given out right at the end of the Biden administration. It took a while, right, to actually get it all together. And unfortunately, that part of the reason we have to really think about how we're going to do cross-sector coordination, because honestly, there are ways it could make things slower rather than faster. And so, if what we're trying to do is avoid duplication or fragmentation, then, we need to set up the agencies fundamentally differently in order to do that. And that's a lift from the legislature at the outset. It's not something agencies can just do by themselves. Having agencies collaborate, again, I think makes the programs work more effectively ultimately, but it takes some time to do. So I don't know that it gets that working on cross-sector once you've got things in place, it makes things faster. But I think there will be time to get there. So, those are challenges. The inefficiency I was talking about was sort of more duplicated effort, right? People are doing the same things, and less about how long it was taking them to do things, so there.
Okay, well, we ran out of time and I don't have any other further questions. And I want to really appreciate you on behalf of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center. I want to say a very big thank you to Professor Kaswan for joining us today. Thank you to all my colleagues and everyone who's online, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you. This was great. And you were also so gracious, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Be well, and I hope I didn't depress you.
No problems. Thank you.
Okay,
All right.
bye.
Bye-bye.